Sometimes, the most powerful people in the world are humbled by the simplest act of kindness. Margaret Chin had worked at Rosewood Diner for 37 years. Her hands were steady, her smile genuine, her heart full of quiet stories collected over decades of pouring coffee for strangers. She'd served everyone, construction workers and congressmen, farmers and movie stars, but she treated each with the same steady grace. That Tuesday morning in October began like any other, but what Margaret witnessed at Booth 7 would ripple far beyond that small-town diner. A little girl sat alone at the corner booth, 8, maybe 9 years old, her soft brown curls resting on her shoulders, her big brown eyes swimming with tears. The yellow dress she wore had tiny daisies printed across it, cheerful against her sadness. Around her, laughter echoed from the next table, cool, sharp laughter that made Margaret's heart tighten. The men responsible weren't men at all, but teenage boys. 3 of them, maybe 16, smirking as they made faces in the girl's direction. At the table beside her sat a man, in a navy blue suit, absorbed in his phone. His voice was low, clipped, full of numbers and urgency. Yes, finalize the deal. No. Tell legal I need that report in 20 minutes, he said, barely glancing up. Margaret had seen his kind before, driven, brilliant, and completely blind to the world just beyond their screens. She set down the coffee pot, took a deep breath, and walked over. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly, sliding into the seat across from the little girl. "I'm Margaret. What's your name?" The girl wiped her nose with a napkin and whispered, "Sophie. Those boys are being mean to me." Margaret followed her gaze. The boys were laughing again, one contorting his face in mockery. Something inside her, the mother, the protector, snapped. She stood and walked straight to their table. "Boys," she said, her voice calm but unshakable. "That's enough." The ringleader, tall, bleached hair, false confidence, gave her a smirk. "We're not doing anything, lady." Margaret didn't blink. "You're hurting someone who's done nothing to you," she said, her tone carrying decades of maternal authority. "So either you show some kindness or you find somewhere else to eat." For a second, none of them moved. Then the tall boy dropped his gaze. "Whatever," he muttered, and the laughter stopped. When Margaret turned back, Sophie was watching her with wide, shining eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nobody ever tells them to stop." Margaret smiled gently, though her heart ached. "They should," she said. "And you don't deserve to be treated that way, sweetheart." At that moment, Sophie's father ended his call. He looked up, impatient, glancing around the diner. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with gray at his temples and the restless energy of someone who never stopped moving. "Sophie, we need to go," he said, reaching for his wallet. "I have another meeting." "But, Daddy, I haven't finished my pancakes." He glanced at his watch, torn between the schedule and his daughter's small voice. It was a familiar scene to Margaret, one she watched too many times. Busy parents missing the quiet cries of children who only wanted to be seen. What she didn't know was that this man, James Morrison, was one of the richest men in the country, CEO of a multinational tech empire. Yet in this simple diner, he was about to learn a lesson worth more than any fortune he'd ever made. James checked his phone again, anxiety gnawing at him. The Continental merger was on the line, and every minute away from his office felt like hemorrhaging money. Sophie was slow with her pancakes, poking at them without eating. "Come on, princess," he said, forcing patience. "We really do need to hurry." Margaret, who had returned to pouring coffee for another table, kept glancing back. The girl's body language was familiar. Small shoulders drawn in, eyes downcast. It reminded her painfully of her own son, Danny, born with cerebral palsy. She learned to recognize the quiet heartbreak of a child who felt different. She approached the table gently. "Excuse me, sir," she said. "I don't mean to intrude, but your daughter seems upset. Some boys were bothering her earlier." James blinked, genuinely startled. "What boys?" She nodded toward the departing teenagers. For the first time that morning, James really looked at Sophie, saw the tear streaks, the trembling lips, the tiny hands clutching her napkin. "Sophie, honey," he said, his voice softening. What happened? They were making fun of me, she whispered. They said I look funny and talk weird. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He'd been sitting 3 feet away, completely unaware that his daughter had been humiliated. Margaret could see the realization hit him. The moment when guilt cracked through the armor of success. Your daughter is beautiful, she said gently. But children like Sophie, they need us to fight for them. They feel everything deeper than most. James looked at this waitress, a stranger, who had done for his child what it failed to do. The words, the truth, cut deeper than he expected. He'd built billion-dollar empires, but hadn't seen the tears of his own daughter. How often does this happen? He asked Sophie quietly. She hesitated. A lot, she said finally. At school, too. People stare. James's throat tightened. While he'd been busy winning deals, Sophie had been fighting invisible battles alone. Margaret poured him a fresh cup of coffee. Mr. Morrison, she said softly. She caught his name during his phone call. She's lucky to have you, but she needs more than a good school or nice clothes. She needs to know she's your priority. James leaned back, silent. That truth hit harder than any boardroom defeat ever had. I work hard to give her everything, he murmured, almost offensively. Therapists, tutors. Those are important, Margaret said kindly. But what she really needs is your time. Children like Sophie often feel like burdens. You have to show her she's a joy. Sophie looked up then, her voice trembling. Daddy, are you disappointed that I'm different? James froze. The words shattered him. Oh, sweetheart, no, he said, taking her small hand. You're perfect exactly as you are. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel anything less. Sophie smiled faintly, the kind of practice smile a child learns when they stop expecting too much. And that broke him more than tears ever could. Margaret could see it too. Maybe, she said softly, it's time for both of you to start over, together. James looked at her, then at Sophie, and something inside him shifted. A quiet, irreversible click of the heart. For a long moment, James said nothing. The clatter of plates and low hum of conversation filled the diner, but between him and his daughter, silence reigned, a heavy, transforming silence. Margaret, sensing something had shifted, began to move away, but Sophie tugged at her sleeve. Miss Margaret, she said softly, can you stay? Please. Margaret looked into those hopeful brown eyes and nodded. Of course, sweetheart. She slid back into the booth beside Sophie, ignoring the growing line of customers waiting for refills. Some moments, she knew, mattered more than coffee. James exhaled, his voice softer now. You said she needs to feel like a joy, not a burden. Margaret nodded. Every child does. But children like Sophie, they see everything. They notice when you're looking past them instead of at them. James stared at his phone, then turned it face down. For the first time, he didn't care about the messages piling up. You're right, he admitted. I've been chasing everything except what matters. Margaret smiled. Then it's not too late to change that. Sophie leaned against her father's shoulder tentatively, and to Margaret's quiet joy, James didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped an arm around his daughter, awkwardly at first, then naturally, as if remembering something long forgotten. Margaret decided to take a small risk. You know, Mr. Morrison, she said, I've been serving your daughter pancakes for months now. She always brings a notebook full of drawings. James blinked. Drawings? Sophie blushed and pulled the little spiral book from her backpack. They're just pictures, she murmured. Can I see them? James asked. For a second. Sophie hesitated, as if unsure whether he really wanted to. Then she opened it, and the pages bloomed with color. Crayon and pencil sketches filled the worn paper. Her dad, a big house with flowers, a golden retriever, 2 stick figures flying kites. James felt his throat tighten. These are incredible, sweetheart. I draw the things I wish we could do together, Sophie said quietly, like bake cookies or go to the park. The words hit him like a hammer. He had never noticed her notebook before, never realized that the tiny drawings were dreams. Unspoken wishes of a little girl who just wanted her father's attention. Margaret watched his face soften, the iron businessman melting into a father rediscovering love. You know, she said, Maybe today's a good day to start one of those drawings for real. James blinked. What do you mean? She smiled. Cancel your meetings. Spend one day just being Sophie's dad. No phones, no business calls, just her. It sounded almost impossible. But something inside James, something that had been asleep for years, woke up. He pulled out his phone, opened his calendar full of board meetings, and began typing. One by one, he canceled them. Are you sure, Daddy? Sophie whispered. Won't your boss get mad? James chuckled softly. I am the boss, he said, and you're my most important meeting. Margaret felt her throat tighten as she watched Sophie's face light up, a mix of surprise, joy, and relief. James reached across the table, took her small hand, and said, What do you want to do today, Princess? Sophie didn't hesitate. Can we paint? Like in my drawings? He smiled. Then we'll paint. All day if you want. As they walked out of the diner, hand in hand, Margaret stood at the counter watching them go. A billionaire who had just been humbled by love, and a little girl who had just been seen, truly seen, for the first time. 3 months later, the bell above the diner door chimed again. Margaret was wiping down tables when she heard a familiar laugh. High, bright, unrestrained. She turned, and there they were, James and Sophie Morrison. But they were different now. Sophie glowed with confidence, her hair tied back with a paint-stained ribbon. James looked relaxed, years younger, wearing jeans and a sweatshirt instead of his usual tailored suit. Margaret. Sophie ran to her and threw her arms around her waist. Look what Daddy and I made. She held up a colorful canvas bursting with swirls of blue, yellow, and pink. We've been taking art classes together, she announced proudly. James followed, carrying another painting, a slightly crooked but charming landscape. Turns out, he said with a sheepish grin, I have a lot to learn from my teacher here. Margaret laughed, pouring them their usual coffee and chocolate milk without asking. You both look happy, she said. We are, James replied, happier than I've been in years. Sophie's been teaching me about color and patience. He took a sip of coffee, thoughtful. I thought cutting back on work would cost me everything, but it didn't. My company's thriving, and for the first time, I actually am, too. Sophie beamed. And Daddy's coming to my school play next week. And we're getting a dog. Margaret chuckled, shaking her head in delighted disbelief. Well, sounds like someone figured out what matters most. James nodded. A wise waitress once told me that my daughter didn't need more money. She needed me. Best business advice I've ever received. As they stood to leave, Sophie handed Margaret a small package wrapped in bright paper. This is for you, she said shyly. Inside was a drawing, the diner, with all three of them sitting in booth 7. Margaret wore a superhero cape. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, Sophie had written, Margaret the kindness angel. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. She hugged Sophie tightly. Thank you, sweetheart, she whispered. This means more to me than you know. James reached out his hand. You saved my relationship with my daughter, he said simply. I'll never forget that. Margaret smiled. You saved it yourself, she said. All I did was remind you what love looks like when you stop rushing past it. As they left, the billionaire and his little girl, Margaret watched them step into the afternoon light. They didn't look like a mogul and his child anymore. They looked like a father and daughter who had found each other again. And as the door closed behind them, Margaret whispered to herself, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. She returned to her counter, wiping away tears she didn't bother to hide. Outside, the world bustled on, deals made, fortunes traded. But inside that small diner, something sacred had happened. A billionaire had rediscovered his heart, and a little girl had found her hero not in the boardroom, but in her father's arms. Because in the end, love, not power, not wealth, is what truly makes us rich.